before we can get into detail and really dive into the topic of things that affect bore axis shifts and things that affect our muzzle velocity, we need to kind of have a basic idea of the sequence of events that occurs when we touch off a round, okay? So let's just consider the story of what happens when you pull the trigger. So basically, the first thing we got going on is we have the cartridge being chambered, okay? And when your cartridge is in the chamber, one thing you might notice is that your projectile on most of these setups is usually spaced a short distance behind the lands and the grooves of your rifle bore, okay? That short distance is, there's a lot of different terms guys call this, but like free bore is what I know it as. Some guys call it the lead. There's different terms for this. But some target shooters like to have the bullet actually touching the lands, and we'll discuss that a little later when we talk about our pressure curves and dynamics here. But usually there's a short distance, like a fraction of an inch. On some rifles, it can be a pretty large distance, like a half an inch. So if you're just shooting standard factory-style ammunition in a normal bolt-action rifle that's just factory, you're going to have a little bit of lead in there. You're going to have a little bit of free bore. So your bullet's not quite touching the lands and grooves. So there's a little bit of a room forward that's basically free before it encounters any kind of resistance. Okay, let's say you go ahead and you got your round chambered, and you go ahead and you pull the trigger. What happens is your firing pin is going to strike the primer. Now, the impact of the firing pin, if you look at this picture I'll draw here of the primer, the impact of the firing pin crushes the cup of the primer. That's this outside part, okay? And on the inside of a primer, this is a boxer primer, okay? There's two main styles that they use on centerfire rifle cartridges. They have berdan primed and boxer primed. In the United States, what's popular here is boxer primed. What's inside of a primer is a little thing called an anvil. And what happens is you have this real sensitive ignition compound inside your primer, and when your firing pin hits it, that rubs the back of the cup where the primer hit against that anvil, and that sensitive ignition compound ignites. It just basically explodes, okay? The difference between boxer primed and berdan primed is the construction of that anvil. In our American-made boxer primed ammunition, the anvil is located in the primer. It's actually built into the primer. So when you pop a primer out, you can look on the old one. There's that little weird triangle-looking deal in there. That's the anvil of the primer. That's the little part that rubbed the two metal surfaces together in there, which ignites the priming compound. If you look at a berdan primed round, you can see that basically if you look inside, like the case, or if you can somehow get the primer out of there, you can see there's two little flash holes on the side, just not like a center flash hole. That's because in the center, that's where your anvil is built into the brass case, actually. So at any rate, what happens is your firing pin hits the primer, and that little guy goes off. And that what happens is you have hot gases and all the incandescent particles released from primer ignition, and they flow into the case like real fast. And they all that hot, super heated gas, fire, goes in between the propellant granules that you have in your cartridge case, all your gunpowder, okay? And that begins the ignition of the outside surfaces of the propellant granules inside the case. Now, sometimes what you have happen is that this is where you might possibly get the first movement of your projectile inside the cartridge case, okay? When your primer goes off, if you really, really slow this down in super, super slow motion, there's a pressure spike because you have an explosion in your primer. That is enough sometimes to dislodge that projectile from the neck of the case there, and it might pop it out and get it up. It might move it forward just slightly, and then it'll stop due to friction. Either it'll encounter the forcing cone up in the bore there, or it'll just get stuck in the neck again. But sometimes that's the first movement of your bullet. And that can even occur before your propellant really starts igniting. So after that happens, your propellant starts to burn. And the chamber is sealed in the rear by the bolt face, right? And the bullet is in the front. So all those gases and the energy created by the primer and the igniter and the propellant that's starting to burn, they have nowhere to go. So you start to have a really, really dramatic increase in pressure instantly. Just right when your primer goes off, right as your propellant starts to burn. And the temperature within the chamber obviously climbs up a lot too. And, the burning rate of the propellant, if you look at this, is roughly proportional to the pressure. So the increase in the pressure is accompanied by an increase in the rate at which further gas is produced. So the next thing that happens here is you have all that raising pressure that starts the forward motion of the projectile through the barrel. So once your pressure builds up to the point to where the rearward pressure on your projectile exceeds the frictional pressure holding your projectile in place, that's when the motion begins. And that's known as what is called the shot start pressure. Okay? Shot start pressure. That's basically your inside of the case pressure builds up above the frictional forces that are holding your bullet in place. So once the projectile encounters the rifling, it might start to move forward, but it's going to hit that rifling, and it's going to really slow it down or completely stop it again. Now, this is super, super slow motion we're talking about here. And it's going to stop there until the pressure has increased enough to overcome the resistance of the bore. So, you got to consider like that, the outside of the jack of the bullet, it has to really start to conform to the shape of the rifling before it can move down the bore, right? So once the jacket is fully engraved into the rifling, the resistance then decreases, thereby allowing the rapidly increasing pressure behind it to accelerate that projectile forward again. So really, if you look at this in super slow motion, the bullet can start and stop several times as the powder combustion increases, which builds up the pressure inside the case. Basically, once you've got all your frictional stuff evened off, once your bullet's fully inside the rifling, then your friction forces really level off. And then as your pressure increases, that can start to really accelerate your projectile down the bore. So once your projectile starts moving forward, you got to think that the volume behind the projectile starts increasing, right? So you have more space back there. So you need to fill up all that extra space with more high-pressure propellant gases in order to keep it moving. So what happens is you have all your little different propellant granules, the little grains of gunpowder, and they continue burning from the outside towards the middle of them, okay? So that's why they're in little granules. If it was just a super, super fine powder, it would all just explode at once. But this is a propellant. It's not really an explosive. It's a high-burning or fast-burning propellant. So as the propellant granules continue burning, they're going to be producing those high-pressure gases so much faster than the projectile can really increase its motion that your result is going to be that you're going to have that pressure continuing to rise. Even though your volume behind the bullet is getting larger, your propellant's burning so fast that it increases the pressure until your peak pressure is reached. And that's the peak pressure is the highest point in your pressure curve, obviously. Now, although there's different pressure begins to fall after this peak pressure point, you still have an acceleration of the bullet. And the way this works is really you hit the all burnt position, okay? And this is the point at which all of the propellant that you're burning is completed. It's done burning. But even though the powder is completely burnt at this point, and this is called the all burnt position, the propellant gas, the gases that you built up, the fire, that's still continuing to expand. And so as a result, your bullet's still accelerating. Even though your powder's burnt up at this point, you still have fire back there that's needing to expand, right? So you continue your acceleration. Now, your acceleration rate lessens, so you're still building up speed, but at the rate at which it's building starts to level off. So although the acceleration lessens, it's still accelerating. So it's still building up speed of the projectile. Now, at the moment the projectile leaves the muzzle, the pressure will have been reduced to like a fraction of what the peak pressure was. So like generally speaking, maybe about like a third of the energy expended during this whole process is actually used to push the projectile forward. A lot of the other energy that was expended here, like the other 2/3 are absorbed by the rifle, transferred into recoil energy or something like that, or it's lost to like metal expansion and things like heat. So only a certain fraction of that is actually used to propel that projectile forward. Now, you're going to have a flow of gases following the projectile out the muzzle. And even though for a short distance after your bullet exits the muzzle, you're still going to have an additional acceleration for a real short time. And that's something we're going to cover real briefly in transitional ballistics. So your maximum velocity is actually a little bit beyond your muzzle velocity. So it's past your muzzle just a little bit. And that depends on exactly what kind of setup you got going on with your your muzzle brake, or if you're shooting with the suppressor. Things like that can affect how that transition is going to take place. But you're going to have all the noise and shock of firing. That's caused by basically the jetting of all them gases just shooting out as your projectile exits and enters the atmosphere, right? So all that's going to cause that shock and that explosion sound. And basically after all this, your projectile breaks away from the influence of the rifle and begins its independent flight. And then we're into external ballistics. So you still have a slight increase in muzzle velocity, a little tiny bit past the muzzle. So now we can consider, here's what that pressure curve looks like. We could talk about that real briefly. And all this happens in like a millisecond. Maybe a little bit over a millisecond. A millisecond is 1,000th of a second, okay? So there's 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second. And as you can see, your peak pressure is going to be a little bit, maybe at the 50% mark, maybe a little bit less. And you have a real fast buildup in pressure. And then after that, it starts to drop off. Now, even though the pressure is dropping off, you still have an acceleration all the way until the bullet exits. It's just that your rate of acceleration is not going to be as great. And this is just your pressure curve. This isn't your acceleration curve of the projectile going down the bore. This is just the pressure. But you still have a rapid expansion of all those gases, even after your powder burnout, like we said before. Now, as we're staring at this graph here, you got to consider all the different possibilities of things that could happen on a microscopic level inside your bore or with your ammunition. There's a lot of, if you really zoom in on these individual components, the layout of how your powder grains are laying inside your case, exactly which direction or at the seating depth your primer is, what your flash hole looks like, the amount of lead you have before the bullet hits the rifling, the dimensions of the rifling. You might have micro fractures in the steel of the bore due to barrel break-in. All these different things are going to severely affect not only the pressure curve, but are going to affect the bore dynamics and the frictional resistance that your bullet is going to experience going through the bore, right? So all these things, this is where the internal ballistics gets confusing, because there's a lot of stuff going on. And that can be, it can really perplex a guy if you really get into the vortexing spiral of confusion on this one. It can be confusing. But these are things that we're going to have to consider. So any change in any one of these things is going to affect all the other things. And it's not always a directly proportional relationship, because, there's just a lot going on. If you have a little bit of a frictional change at a certain point in the bore, that can change your pressure curve, which can change the vibratory wave going through your rifle, which can change your axis of your bore. A completely different way that a different kind of frictional change would affect it in a different part of the barrel. So there's infinite possibilities of how all these different variables are going to play against each other, really. And that's why when you lay down and shoot a group, they're not all in the same hole, because you do have variation. And it's basically impossible to really account for each individual variation completely. That would be quite the feat to accomplish, especially in a field deployment kit, like a regular rifle you're going to be carrying around. It's not like you can carry around a complete laboratory with you. Although, with our long-range equipment selection, you might think we're carrying a long-range shooting laboratory with you out in the field. And you kind of are in a sense. But there's just a lot of stuff going on. And the main thing to take home from this part of the video is you got all these opposing forces, right? So you have basically two opposing forces if you want to break it down. You have the propellant force on the backside of the projectile, and that's caused by the high pressure of the propellant gases pushing the projectile forward. And in the front, you have the counteraction of the frictional force between the projectile and the rifle bore, okay? And that's going to have like high resistance in certain points of where your projectile is. Like during the engraving process, for example, when your bullet is trying to conform to the bore in the rifling, that's going to have like a huge amount of resistance compared to when the bullet is halfway down the bore. It's fully conformed, and you got all your rub marks basically caused on there. So your frictional dynamics are going to become very important as well. So we're going to have to basically keep track of all our different bore conditions, our coppering, our fouling, our bore temperatures, all these things, our bore wear, how many rounds you got through the rifle, that's all going to affect this as well. And that can affect both your axis of bore changes and your muzzle velocity changes, because if you change anything, including muzzle velocity, that's going to change the vibration nature of your weapon, like we talked about in the harmonics video, right? So your peak pressure, together with the travel of the projectile and the bore, that's going to kind of determine your velocity at which the projectile exits a muzzle. And this curve that we're looking at here, there's a lot of different ways to plot pressure curves. There's like elastic strength pressure travel curves, permissible pressure travel curves. We're not going to worry about those. We're just going to look at an actual pressure travel curve. And that's the best representation, in my opinion, of the actual pressure that's developed during firing within the bore. And that's the one we're just looking at and discussing here. But initially, just to summarize the whole story, we have pressure increases dramatically as the gunpowder burn initiates. And the initial resistance of the projectile stuck in the lands of the bore, until that's overcome, you're going to have a huge increase in pressure. After that resistance is overcome, the actual pressure gradually starts to decrease because of the concepts. Basically, if you look at Boyle's law, and that's just talking about how volume increases, pressure decreases, So you have that increase in volume behind the projectile after it starts moving. Obviously, your pressure is going to go down. That's just basic physics and chemistry and stuff. So that's basically a summary of what happens when you pull a trigger, okay? Now, all the details of the variations that occur with all those different components and all the dynamics of your projectile against your bore and all that, that's going to determine what your bore axis shifts are going to look like. That's going to affect your harmonic vibration inconsistencies, everything like that. And it's also going to affect your muzzle velocity. So those are the two main things that we're going to wrestle with on internal ballistics, is changes in the harmonic and vibratory nature of the gun due to inconsistencies. We're going to deal with those. And also we're going to talk about your changes in your muzzle velocity and the variations that can be experienced due to inconsistencies there. So the main part of, you might be wondering, how in the heck do you deal with all this? Well, if you have to summarize it into one word, we're going to try to keep everything as consistent as possible. So whatever you're doing with your bore, whatever you're doing with your ammunition, once you start the ball rolling on this whole long-range shooting game, you're going to want to keep it exactly the same as far as possible. Things that we can't control, like ambient air temperature, things like that. You're not going to take a thermostat hooked on a furnace out in the field to keep your ammunition and your weapon all completely at the same temperature. That's crazy. That's just going a little too far. So the things like temperature, we're going to have to account for that. Otherwise, the main way to reduce the effects of all these things is by consistency. All right. So that's a good introduction into the subject of advanced internal ballistics. Now we're going to go into detail. Our next video is we're going to start discussing bore axis shifts, specifically harmonic vibratory inconsistencies, rifle system rigidity, poor rifle deployment, and then we'll discuss very briefly muzzle brake pull-off. So stay tuned.